What is going on, Technical? My name is Billy Squid, and welcome to the Beginner's Guide for starter classes in Elden Ring, specifically ranking the starter classes from worst to best in Elden Ring. Now, this is strictly a beginner's guide to the starter classes. This is taking into consideration the first hour or so of PvE content that you will have with a starter class. Nothing else is going to be factored in, such as PvP builds or starter items moving forward. So anybody familiar with RPGs knows that some starter classes just hit a little bit different, and I want to give my input on the best starter classes just so that any beginner players out there go in with as much information as they can and can make an informed decision. None of the starter classes are bad per se, but there are some that are a little bit higher skill ceiling than others, and some that are just objectively worse than others, and we're going to break that down right now. So without further ado, let's get into the guide. So starting this guide off, let's talk about the Prophet, what I consider probably the worst starting class in the game for beginner builds in Elden Ring. And the reasons why I say that come in a few different flavors. For one, the Prophet's armor is some of the worst, if not the worst, starting class armor that you can get outside of the Wretch, who doesn't even come with armor. You get 3 slots of armor, a headband, a chest piece, and leggings. You do not come with gloves, so you're still missing an armor piece there. But even if you did, all of these armor pieces are some of the lowest defense armor pieces out of the starter classes. And not just in terms of armor, the Prophet also has one of the worst starter weapons, in my opinion, in Elden Ring. The Prophet comes with the short spear, and before we start making size jokes, it is not about the size of the weapon, it is how you use it. And unfortunately, the short spear just comes out bottom tier in both regards. It has decent range for the starter weapons, but it has low damage, and it is mainly single target thrust damage, which in Elden Ring's early game and in Elden Ring in general, sweep attacks are very, very good, as a lot of the open world content and dungeon content is going to put you up against multiple foes at once. The short spear just does not have the capabilities of dealing with those very, very easily. The one saving grace of the short spear, though, is the impaling thrust weapon art that does an extremely good job at staggering enemies. If you need something to get staggered from a pretty decent distance, this is going to be the case. But even though impaling thrust is super duper good, you're going to be using that blue bar for something else most of the time, and that is in the form of catch flame. This is very similar to your combustion pyromancies from the previous Souls games. It is a very good point blank damage spell, and it kind of makes up for the short spear's lack of damage. The only problem with it is it is a point blank damage spell, and with the charge up being necessary on that, putting yourself in that position, charging it up, and then casting it, you can see yourself getting staggered out of that animation more than I would like to see. And there's no really hyper armor on it, so that makes it another higher skill type of spell to use. The Prophet does start off, however, with an incredibly high mind and faith stat. So if faith is something that you are wanting to kind of look into in the future of your build, the Prophet might not be a bad start for it. But just know that that first hour or so of this game is going to be a bit difficult to get off the ground, especially considering you don't get faith spells very quickly or very early in this game. It is going to be a struggle to get this build going, but once it does, I have a feeling you are going to have a lot of fun with it. Like I said, there's no bad builds in this game. This is just the hardest build, in my opinion, to start with in Elden Ring. Next up on our list is the Bandit starter class, and this class is a weird one. This class comes with the highest arcane stat in the game, and arcane is best compared to luck in the previous Souls games, although it has a bit more applications in this game than what it do in the prior Souls games. Arcane is actually used in quite a few of the damage spells in the game, so it's interesting in that regard. Also, it does affect bleed, and the bandit knife that the bandit starts with is a bleed-based weapon. That being said, what else does the bandit have going for it? Well, it has an extremely high dexterity stat as well at 13, but it starts off with the probably second or third worst armor in the game. The bandit knife is not a great weapon if you cannot build that bleed up, though. It has the shortest range out of any of the starter weapons, and while it is extremely quick, it has very little to no stagger potential and little to no damage in that regard. And that is kind of the running theme with the bandit, is it's a high risk, high reward build. It comes with a buckler, which is a parrying shield, but enemies that you can't parry, or if you're not good at parrying, you're not going to be benefiting from the enhanced crit that the knife class starts with in Elden Ring. The one saving grace, however, of the Bandit starter class and why I rank it above the Prophet class is it at least has a range stat in the form of the short bow. And while the short bow's weapon art barrage is just a big waste of arrows, it will enhance your DPS if you are desperate to get a little bit more damage out. But having a ranged component in these games, especially starting out as a new player, is extremely helpful. You can use the bow to kind of single out enemies from a group, get 1v1s a lot easier, and hey, maybe you'll be able to get more backstabs going in that regard. But as you can see from this video, the short bow doesn't do that much damage either, and just given the total of low DPS that the Bandit provides through most of the game up until you get a new bow or a new weapon, this is an extremely difficult class to start with the only saving grace being the ranged component. And that is what I would consider the last of the quote-unquote bad starter classes in Elden Ring. So if this info has been helpful for you so far, maybe like the video and subscribe to the channel. We're going to be doing a lot more beginner guides moving forward. But let's get into the next starter class, and that is the Warrior. Now, the Warrior was an interesting one. I didn't expect it to play specifically how it did, and I was surprised in some aspects and disappointed in others. The Warrior starter class is the only starter class in the game that starts off with akimbo weapons. You start off with 2 scimitars with the Warrior starter class, and it's really, really cool. It is a nice introduction to how power stancing works in this game, and the Warrior actually has some of the highest damage per second or damage per single swings out of any of the starter classes right out of the gate. With the highest dexterity start out of any of the starter classes in the game, it's easy to understand why the damage is so high. You also have a little bit of mind and a little bit of health on top of all that, with a little bit of endurance, which is something that I feel the Warrior probably could have used a bit more than the mind stat. The weapon arts, while they are very good, I find the spinning slash to be one of the more underwhelming weapon arts, and you don't really need that enhanced FP with this particular build. What you do need, however, is stamina, which is what the endurance stat governs. And if you're going to be using both of the swords with the Warrior starting class, you need about as much stamina as you can get. I could only get about 3 swings with the akimbo swords before I was out of stamina. And in some cases, if you've been sprinting or dodging during a high pressure encounter, you don't have that stamina to be using on that. So you'll end up either using the single sword, which damage is pretty suboptimal for the most part, or you'll be pulling back to try to get a little bit more stamina. It kind of breaks up the flow of the combat a little bit, and I understand that given the pure damage that the 2 swords can bring, especially early in the game, they needed to kind of taper that down a little bit. I just feel like the stamina usage is a bit excessive, given the fact that you also have some of the weaker armor in the game. It's better than what the armor on the previous classes we mentioned are, but it is still not in the best armor classes for starters. But you would think that the damage would carry a lot of this, and it does, and that's why it's not in the bottom part of my list. The damage is extremely, extremely good with both of the swords. The only real problem with this build is it has no ranged component and no healing component to it. It is just a pure DPS build, and if that's something that you want, more than happy to recommend the Warrior if you are wanting to have that dexterity DPS fantasy. But for people new to the game, it might be a little bit more difficult of a start. You might not realize that your stamina is getting as low as it is, and it could put you in a few bad situations where you get some deaths early, or you end up swapping off of the dual swords altogether just because the stamina stat is too much. That being said, Warrior is a great start, and we are going to move on from here. And moving on, we shall to the sister class of the Warrior, the Hero starter class. This is the strength-based version of what we just talked about, with 16 strength right off the go. The Hero starter class has the best strength-based DPS out of any of the starter classes in the game. That compared with the Axe, it is a very, very strong and very damaging starter class. You might be saying to yourself, Bill, if these are sister classes to each other, why do you rank the Hero higher than what the Warrior was? And this comes in a few flavors. One, the weapon art, as you are seeing on the screen right now, is extremely good and extremely damaging. Wild Strikes is a very, very good weapon art and well worth the blue bar that it costs, which it doesn't cost a lot of. That also being said, the Axe is extremely good for breaking posture on enemies and just has insane DPS in general. It also has pretty wide sweeps for a starter weapon, and I just recommend this weapon in general. It is a very, very good time. The hero, though, does start off with some of the lower rated armor in the starter class pool. While it is a little bit worse than what the warrior's starter armor is, it more than makes up for in the versatility of its weapon, weapon art, and kit. That also being said, the weapon itself and the weapon art does not cost nearly as much stamina as what two-handing the scimitars with the warrior class does. The hero basically does DPS just a little bit more efficiently than what the warrior does, and that's why I rank it higher than what the warrior is. It's also worth mentioning that the hero starts off with a shield, and while it is not a shield that does 100% block damage to physical, it is still better than nothing in a lot of guards, and you can get use out of guard counters pretty easily using this shield, and that's something that a lot of the classes that we've talked about prior didn't really have the capabilities of. Things holding the hero back from being one of the top classes in the game, though, is once again, it doesn't have any ranged component to it, and it doesn't have any healing component to it. Those both factors make an early game experience for specifically a newer or beginner player a little bit more tolerable, and for that, the hero sits where it sits. And speaking of ranged options, let's move on to our ranged characters. Starting off with the prisoner. I put the prisoner where it is in comparison to the astrologer, which is the class it's going to be directly competing with in ranged DPS, for the simple fact that it is a little bit higher skill ceiling to be able to use effectively. It's not as easy as, hey, see that guy over there? Fuck that guy over there. I'm going to just cast all these spells at him and kill them. While you can do that, there is a delay on the starter spell that the prisoner starts with, Magic Glint Blade. And if you don't know how to use it or don't know how to work around it, the cast time on it plus the delay that it takes for it to actually come out, you could be getting hit while you're waiting for the spell to come out, or you could be missing the spell entirely due to the fact that from the time that you cast the spell to the time that it actually goes out to the enemy, they have move positions. They might be running at you and it just goes flying past them, or they could be behind something. That being said, though, Magic Glint Blade is probably the strongest ranged spell starting out in the game, and you can charge the spell up for just a little bit of extra FP to get probably about 25% more damage off of it. It does seem to be worth it in most situations if you can afford to charge it up, but that is an increased charge up time on that spell. Having a decent combination of intelligence and dexterity, your damage in both situations, melee and ranged, are going to be very good. Like I said, Magic Glint Blade, very, very good spell early game if you can figure out how to use it properly. And the rapier is nothing to scoff at either. It has the same problems that the short spear had, where it is very much a single target weapon, but at least with this one, the charged R2s do give you some form of sweep in front of you with the charged R2s. Also, it has Impaling Thrust, which does the exact same thing that the short spear's Impaling Thrust did. And I just think overall it is a better weapon than the short spear. It is faster, it does a little bit more damage with the prisoner starting stats, and it has a sweep. So you've got all of that covered. You've got range, you've got short range, and the only really downsides to the prisoner class, in my opinion, is if you're not wanting to go dexterity, it kind of pigeonholes you, at least early game, into that dexterity scaling. And it also starts off with some pretty low rated armor. Combine this with a shield that, while it is probably the most unique shield out of the starter classes, it is not super great for blocking. It actually does better at blocking magic-based attacks than it does physical attacks. And it does do a decent job of parrying if that is your forte. All of these combined to make one of the more maybe mechanically demanding starter classes that you can roll with, but I feel like a very good starter class in general. And now we move to the Astrologer, the other Pew Pew magic boy of the group, and one I would say is a bit more beginner friendly than what the prisoner starting class is. As I said before, this is the, hey, fuck that guy over there in particular starter class. If you want all of the ranged capabilities, this is the one for you. You come equipped with 2 different sorceries, some decent mind stat, and also a very high intelligence stat. Glintstone Pebble is your single target spell, and then you have Glintstone Arc to kind of sweep the battlefield in front of you. If you have everybody lined up in a narrow hallway or just a big group of enemies in front of you, you can hit all of them at once. It is a very, very good spell, and honestly, that spell alone will carry you through a lot of the early sections of the game. But what you have in ranged options, you lack in defensive options, specifically in your armor class being pretty suboptimal. And I'm starting to notice a lot of the armor classes for starter classes in this game are suboptimal. But this one in particular, the robes just don't do a whole lot for you as far as physical damage goes. They're pretty decent for magic resistance. But you also start off with probably the worst starter shield in the game. It gets the job done for basic blocking and basic parrying, but I would not rely on it in any capacity. And you have the short sword. It is very fast. It does okay damage for somebody that is spec'd specifically into doing range damage, but it is definitely something you'll probably want to swap out as soon as possible. And luckily, with the arsenal that you have at your disposal, you probably won't need to rely on the short sword too much. The Astrologer is just a ranged powerhouse. It has very quick, very powerful spells at its disposal, and if you just want to hang back and kill things from a distance, I highly recommend this starter class for you. There's really no downside to it outside of if somebody closes the gap on you, you might have a little bit of a struggle. Or if you run out of blue bar, of course, because given the fact that flasks are a little bit lower at the beginning of the game, you might find yourself in that situation a few times, at least in dungeons. Moving on up and getting close to the top of our list, we have the Vagabond starter class, the one that has the highest health stat starting out. Also has pretty decent strength and dexterity both, with a little bit of endurance sprinkled on top just for a little bit of added. The Vagabond starter class is going to be your tank starter class, and as such, it comes with the best armor in the game. And this armor is ridiculous. This armor will help you out a ton if melee focused combat is something that you're wanting to get invested in, but you are not super confident in your ability to block and roll. Speaking of blocking, you actually start off with one of the few 100% block damage shields in the game. It is very, very good. So if a more defensive playstyle is something that you are wanting to get your hands on, I highly recommend the Vagabond starter class for that. You also start off with the halberd and the longsword, so you have a few options as far as weaponry goes. The halberd giving you more of a ranged poke option, the longsword giving you more of an up-close DPS option. I personally would go with the longsword. Straight sword movesets are just very good in this game, so keep that in mind. You do have the option. Also keeping in mind that with everything that the Vagabond comes equipped with at the start, you will most likely be heavy rolling, so you might need to pull off a few pieces of armor, maybe the gloves, maybe drop the shield, depending on what your playstyle is. If you do not want to heavy roll, then that is something I want you all to keep in mind. But if you don't mind that, or if you're going to be playing more of a block-centric playstyle, maybe just keep all the armor on and go at it, bud. And you would think, given that the Vagabond has all of this defensive capabilities, that it wouldn't have DPS, but boy howdy would you be wrong. The longsword is actually a wonderful weapon, as is the halberd, but like I said, I prefer the longsword. And the weapon art of the longsword is very, very good. Square off, specifically square off with an R2 for that thrust, does ridiculous damage both to health and to enemy posture. You will be staggering enemies quite consistently with that. Keep in mind also that you still have that physical damage shield where you can be doing guard counters very, very quickly. That also makes people's posture break very easily. And this is just a very good melee-centered build. The only downsides to it is it doesn't have a healing stat, and it does not have any way of doing ranged damage. So outside of that, if the melee tank role is something that you are very, very interested in, the Vagabond is not a bad choice, and it might be the best choice for you. Moving closer and closer to the top of our list, we have the Samurai starter class. And this is the starter class that if you want armor, a ranged option, and a very good melee weapon, this is the class for you. It is almost the total package. And some might say this is the best starter class in the game. But for me personally, there's one starter class that does it a little better. And I'll break that down here in a bit. But for the Samurai, you have all of that. The katana that you start with has an amazing weapon art, both in the R1 for gap closing and the R2 for posture breaking and just straight up damage. On top of that, the katana also does bleed damage, so anything that is weak to bleed, you will slowly be building bleed up over time. And the armor that the Samurai starts off with is top tier as well. Not quite as good as the Vagabonds, but it is very good in general. The shield is nothing to write home about. It'll get a parry done if you need it to, but outside of that, I would not recommend it. And the one thing that I will say puts the Vagabond behind the Samurai is the fact that the Samurai has Mighty Shot and a longbow in general. That ranged component makes a big difference, especially early game when you're trying to figure out the game and you're only wanting to fight one enemy at a time. The longbow gives you the option to do so. And Mighty Shot is just way better than what the barrage with the short bow is. It only uses one arrow and almost doubles the damage that that arrow does for just a little bit of a charge up time. It is a very good leading shot style thing. If the enemy doesn't know you're there, you can kind of get that shot off early to get their defenses pretty weakened for whenever they come into melee range. The Samurai is just good, man. And if you're wanting to have a ranged build option that does not require magic or FP, this would be the one for you. The only downside with arrows is they do cost runes for you to upkeep unless you're crafting your own, which crafting actually makes bow builds significantly more viable in this game. So if you've ever wanted to be a ranger style build, this might be the best start for you. And for everybody else, if you're just wanting to have a physical damage build, this might also be the start for you. And before we get to the top of the list, I just wanted to bring up the honorable mention of the Wretch. The Wretch on paper and in practicality is the quote-unquote worst starter class in the game. Having no armor makes you extremely susceptible to every single form of damage, be it physical, bleed, magic. You will be taking it from all sources. That being said, though, the Wretch does start off with the club, and the club is an extremely good weapon. If a bit short-ranged, in the right hands, you can get a lot of good things out of the club. But on paper, the Wretch is the worst starter class in the game. The Wretch is one of those kinds of playstyles that you just can't get with any of the other starter classes, and that's why I didn't put it at the bottom of this tier list, because I don't feel like it deserves that. Yes, on paper, it is the worst starter class in the game, but the experience that comes from picking it as your starter class is something that I don't think should be squandered and should be highly considered depending on what kind of a playstyle you're wanting to get into and how far into the game you are wanting to immerse yourself, because I don't think there's anything more immersive than the Wretch starter class. And lastly, we come to the Confessor, what I consider the best starter class in Elden Ring for my personal playstyle and my biggest recommendation for new players going forward in Elden Ring. The Confessor takes the melee-centric playstyle that I personally like and combines it with the safety of decent armor, a good weapon, and a very reliable and safe heal. Let me break it down for you real quick. The Confessor starts off with what I think is the third best armor in the game, behind the Vagabond and the Samurai, respectively. So you're going to have good defenses in that regard. You also start off with the Broadsword, which is a very good quality scaling weapon, and luckily for you, you have 12 dexterity and 12 strength to utilize both of your damage stats very effectively. You also come with a full physical damage blocking shield, which if you want to play a more defensive playstyle, you have that option. And if you want to play into the guard counter playstyle, you have that option as well. You also start off with 2 miracles, having a 14 faith stat. This is the better faith option in my opinion than starting with the prophet. And the heal that the Confessor starts with is better in my opinion. No, it does not do as much heal as what the prophet's heal does, but it does not root you in place while it is being cast. You have the free flow to walk around. It is a bit slower of a walking pace, but you still have that movement capability to kite away from something while you are healing, and that makes a lot of difference. You might not think it does, but having any form of movement in this game, especially while you're doing a defensive stat like that, makes all of the difference. It is slightly faster from my experience than drinking, and it doesn't do quite as much of a heal, but you can get 3 or 4 of those heals out of your blue bar before you need to refill it. So you could effectively put more points into your blue flask and get more overall heals than what you would having the heal flasks, although I would still keep 1 on you just for emergency healing. But given the fact that you have good damage, very safe build with the armor and the shield variety, and you have a heal, not to mention you also come with the miracle that makes your footsteps silent, so if you're wanting to go a more stealth-oriented route, this is the only build that has anything that's going to benefit that playstyle. And for reasons like this, I highly recommend the Confessor and it is, in my opinion, the best and most beginner-friendly starter class in the game. But let me know what you all think down in the comments below. What starter class did you run? What is your favorite starter class in the game? And what would you recommend to a beginner player? Everybody, let me know down in the comments below. If you liked the video, like it. If you liked what we're doing and want more beginner guide content, or more guide content in general, or more Elden Ring content in general, subscribe to the channel. We are going to be doing a lot more of this, both on the live stream front as well as the video front. So until next time, Tenna Crew, much love. Bye-bye.